We've spent a lot of time this semester talking about organisms. We've talked about animals, both invertebrates and vertebrates. We've talked about fungi and plants. But now we're going to move on to a broader look at biology, specifically the interactions between these organisms, and not only that, the interactions between these organisms and the abiotic aspects of their environment, things like weather and soil and sunshine and moisture, etc., etc. And this is the study of ecology, the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. You can study ecology at a lot of different levels, from the organismal level, which we've used, again, a lot this semester, all the way up through the global level. Organismal ecology is just a look at how the structure and physiology or behavior of an organism help it meet its environmental challenges, right? Help it find food and avoid predators, for instance, in its environment. And we've looked at a lot of that so far. Populations are groups of individuals of the same species living in the same basic area and able to exchange DNA, essentially living as a gene pool. And we've talked about populations before in terms of population genetics. We did that at the beginning of the semester. Population ecology focuses on factors that affect populations over time, things that will allow a population to grow or to shrink, etc., etc. If you then move on to looking at different species, so populations of different species that live in the same area and may interact with one another, we call these communities. And the study of the interactions between these populations is called community ecology. These are, for instance, predator-prey interactions. So a lion is dependent upon the availability of gazelles, right? Gazelles are also dependent upon whether or not there are lions around to eat them. Gazelles are also dependent on grass. So in a way, lions are also dependent on grass and the circle of life, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, this is community ecology. If you take one more step back, one more step more inclusive, instead of just looking at the living populations, living communities in an area, you look at the abiotic parts of an area as well and how they impact the living communities. Then we call this ecosystem ecology. Ecosystems are the community of organisms plus the physical or abiotic factors with which they interact. You know, what kind of minerals are in the rocks and in the soil? Is it a very dry or a very wet area? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it sunny? Is it not? Is it flat or are there mountains? All of these things can impact the types of living organisms that you'll find in a particular area. And so when you throw in the abiotic stuff, we call that ecosystem ecology. But ecosystems don't live in a vacuum, right? So you may look at a desert ecosystem, for instance, or a marine ocean ecosystem, or a forest ecosystem. But these things can butt up against each other. You may have a prairie and a forest that sit next to one another. And so there's interaction between those ecosystems. We call the study of those interactions landscape ecology, or seascape when you're including the oceans as well, right? So shores are a great example of this, right? Where the ocean meets the shore, these are two very different ecosystems. Or where a river meets the ocean and you have freshwater and saltwater, or where a forest meets a prairie, where a desert meets sort of a wetter area, maybe with a mountain and a rain shadow, something like that. These are all examples of places where different ecosystems are going to butt up against each other and interact and affect one another, and this is called landscape ecology. And then you can take one more step back and look at the entire planet. And we sometimes call this the biosphere, or the global ecosystem. And if you look at all of these different ecosystems together and how they interact as one planet, this is global ecology, right? So if you look at the entire biosphere, it's global ecology. There may be a day later on, in a long, long time, when we're looking at galactic ecology, if ever we find life on other planets. But for now, the only place that we know of that has life for sure is the Earth. And so for now, global ecology is kind of the biggest and most broad and inclusive a category you can study. One major factor in what an ecosystem looks like is its climate. And climate is the long-term prevailing weather condition. So it's different than just weather. Weather is different day to day. For instance, sometimes you live in Minnesota and you get a particularly warm day. You might be warmer than you are in Cincinnati, but generally it's going to be colder in Minnesota than in Cincinnati. Or my father-in-law and I have some other family live down in Georgia, and they will occasionally get a cold snap where they are colder than we are up here. Every now and then they even get snow, which is wild, and they don't know what to do. But generally, it is warmer. The climate in Georgia is warmer than it is here. Generally, it's wetter here than it is in California, even though occasionally there are days where it's raining in California and it's dry in Cincinnati. Anyway, macroclimate are big patterns on regional landscape, sometimes global level, and microclimate is patterns in very, very specific places. It's underneath a fallen log. It's going to be a little bit cooler and wetter than it is in the area around there, and certainly shadier. Our global climate patterns tend to be driven by our sun and the position of the Earth in the universe and the solar system, because the sun is our source of energy, which means it's our source of warmth, it's our source of evaporation of water, and the sun doesn't shine equally across the whole planet. At the equator, for instance, the sun is directly overhead, so it's coming at a straight angle, whereas because the Earth is curved, as you get further away from the equator, the same beam of light lands on a much wider swath of the Earth, and it lands at an angle, and so you don't get quite as much heat or quite as much energy as you do in the same amount of area at the equator. So the equator tends to be warmer than those areas further away from the equator. This difference in the way the sun shines on the Earth and the difference that results in terms of temperature also can cause global air circulation and precipitation patterns. So you see differences in precipitation, for instance, at different parts of the Earth. Very generally, if you look right at the equator here, so we zoom in here, it's warmer, and that means there's more evaporation, and air can hold more water when it's warmer. And that air, as it warms up, it gets bigger, right? It expands, and air that expands goes up. Hot air rises. You're probably familiar with that. But as it rises, right, and gets bigger, it sort of pushes away from itself. It takes up more space, and so it pushes away from itself, and it pushes out this way. And eventually, it cools down. As it gets higher in the air and away from the equator, it tends to cool down. And when air cools, it then cannot hold quite as much water, right? Cold air can't hold as much water, and so that water falls out of the sky. We call that rain, and so you tend to get a lot of rain pretty close to the equator. As this stuff goes up in the air and moves away from the equator, it cools off due to the altitude and then moving away from the equator. Then by the time this air gets over here, it's cooler, and so it tends to fall. Cold air sinks. But by the time it sinks, it's dry. It's bone dry. And so around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, you tend to get these pressure systems where you have dry air falling down, and then it pushes the air that is in existence closer to, down and up, both directions. But it pushes it down here, and this further pushes this warm air up, and you get these cycles of flow, but essentially you have dry air coming down here, and then wet air coming up here and causing rain. Now, these pressure systems, right, warm air creates high pressure, cold air creates low pressure, create wind as well, prevailing winds, and also the fact that water and land warm up differently, and land is not equally distributed around the globe, and so you end up getting these very predictable trade winds, westerlies, and then north and southeast trade winds. So much of the Earth's climate is just driven by the fact that the Earth is spherical and the sun hits the equator more intensely than it does areas further away from the equator, especially the poles, obviously, which get the least amount of energy. But there are some other things that impact the climate as well. For instance, it's not a single temperature in a particular part of the earth all year long, right? It's getting warmer or colder where you live, depending on what time of year it is. Mountains, large bodies of water can also affect local or regional climates. Our most obvious seasonal changes in climate have to do with the tilt of the earth. So the earth is not straight up compared to the sun. It's tilted, as you can see here. And so for part of the year, so the earth goes around, but the tilt stays in the same direction, right? So part of the year, like in June, for instance, the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, and so it actually gets more direct sunlight than it does, for instance, in December, when it's tilted away from the sun. And so days are longer, which means you have longer for the ground to heat up. You have more direct sunlight, which carries more energy with it, and June is warmer. December, you have more time in the dark because days are longer, or days are shorter, nights are longer, and so you have more time to cool down rather than warm up. Plus, the sun is coming at an angle, which means less energy, and December is cooler, right? In September and March, you're about even Steven in terms of number of hours in the day versus number of hours in the night, whether you're in the northern or the southern hemisphere. Now, in the northern hemisphere, September tends to be a little bit warmer than March because we've been warming up for a whole summer, right? So now we have to cool down. Whereas March, we've been cold all winter and we're just starting the warm up. But the reason we have these temperature differences seasonally is because of the tilt of the earth. Large bodies of water can also affect a regional climate, both because large bodies of water tend to moderate the climates of land masses nearby, but also because there are prevailing, just like there are prevailing winds, there are prevailing currents of water that carry warm or cold water to particular places, and they can affect the local climate. For instance, affecting the U.S., we have a current that runs from close to the equator back up toward the southeastern United States and then the rest of the East Coast. And if you've ever been to Florida or Georgia or the Carolinas on the beach, the water is really, really warm for a lot of the year, as opposed to California, where you have a current that's coming up from the north, an Arctic current. And so even if you're at the same latitude, right, you're at Myrtle Beach in South Carolina or you're in San Diego, the water in San Diego is going to be much colder for most of the year. Similarly, this southern current brings warm water all the way up toward Britain, right? And so Europe, especially England, is really, really far north, right? England and Ireland, but they tend to have very moderate temperatures for being as far north as much of Canada because they have this warm water that comes up their way and moderates their temperatures. Additionally, because water is cohesive, because of those hydrogen bonds, it's hard to break apart. It takes a lot of energy to do it. And so oceans, big bodies of water, large lakes tend to hold a lot of energy. So during the day, they take a while to heat up, and the air heats up more quickly around the land, and it gets bigger, it expands, and then it goes up, and it sucks a cool breeze from the water to moderate the temperature of the land during the hot day. At night, the water stays kind of warm. It's a big thermal mass. The land cools off more quickly. Air sinks, and it pushes air back towards the water, and then you have warm air from the water that's expanding and pushing kind of a warmer breeze back toward the land, and so water moderates land temperature. Mountainous terrain can also affect the climate of a region. So as wet air comes in across the land, and that air gets pushed up because of a mountain range, that air cools off due to the altitude. And we know that air that gets cool can't hold as much water, so you tend to get a lot of rain right here on this side of the mountain, where the prevailing winds are coming from. Then by the time that air gets over to the other side of the mountain, and it comes back down, it's bone dry. And so very often, on the windward side of a mountain, you have a lot of rain. On the leeward side of a mountain, you have deserts. And this is called a rain shadow. You find a lot of big deserts, like, for instance, the Sonoran Desert in California, on the leeward side of mountains. Also in Peru, the Atacama Desert is on the other side, the leeward side of a mountain.